Volcker interest rate shock. What if the only way to save the economy was to destroy it first? By the late 1970s, the U.S. economy was in chaos. Imagine gas lines stretching for blocks, prices soaring every month, and jobs vanishing all at once. This wasn't your typical recession. It was something worse: stagflation. Inflation was skyrocketing, peaking at 13.5% in 1980. But the economy wasn't growing. In fact, it was sputtering. Real GDP bounced like a yo-yo, even shrinking in some years. America was stuck in a vicious cycle, and no one seemed to know how to stop it. But one man had a plan so extreme, it made him the most hated figure in America. For a while. Enter Paul Volcker, the newly appointed chair of the Federal Reserve in 1979. At 6'7", Volcker was physically imposing, and his economic strategy would prove just as towering. While previous leaders tiptoed around inflation, Volcker went to war with it. His weapon? Interest rates, massive ones. Volcker made a bold and deeply unpopular decision. He jacked up the federal funds rate from around 10% to over 20% in just over a year. The move was brutal. Mortgage rates soared, borrowing dried up, businesses collapsed, unemployment surged. The country plunged into back-to-back recessions, and angry citizens mailed him 2x4s to protest what they saw as him breaking the economy. But here's the twist. It worked. Inflation, the monster haunting the economy for a decade, finally began to fall. By restoring faith in the Fed and proving that inflation could be tamed, Volcker didn't just fix a problem, he reset the rules of monetary policy. His shock therapy laid the foundation for decades of economic stability and made fighting inflation the #1 job of central banks around the world. Plaza Accord, currency intervention. What happens when the world's biggest economies secretly gang up on their own money? In the mid-1980s, the US dollar was too strong for its own good. Fueled by Reagan-era tax cuts, massive government spending, and sky-high interest rates, the dollar was crushing it on global markets. Sounds good, right? Not quite. American products were becoming way too expensive overseas, and cheap imports were flooding into the US, wiping out factories, farms, and jobs. The US trade deficit was exploding, especially with Japan and West Germany. Washington was freaking out, and whispers of protectionism were getting louder. So what did the world do? They met at the Plaza Hotel in New York City and pulled off something never seen before. The Plaza Accord, a secret sauce agreement between the US, Japan, West Germany, France, and the UK to team up and tank the dollar. Seriously. The plan? Everyone would sell US dollars on the foreign exchange markets, flooding the system and forcing its value down. It was global economic tag team action. And it worked. Fast. The dollar plummeted nearly 50% against the Japanese yen in just 2 years. This move helped US exports bounce back, but Japan. Totally different story. The soaring yen made Japanese goods expensive abroad. To cushion the blow, Japan opened the floodgates on easy money, low interest rates, cheap credit, and booming speculation. That turned into a massive stock and real estate bubble, which spectacularly burst in the early 90s, dragging Japan into what became known as the Lost Decade. TARP and Fed QE programs. The economy was seconds from a total meltdown. And then, the government did the unthinkable. In 2008, the US economy came terrifyingly close to total collapse. It started with banks handing out risky home loans like candy. When the housing bubble burst, those loans, packaged into complex financial products, blew up on Wall Street. Lehman Brothers collapsed, AIG nearly went under, and global credit markets froze. Suddenly, even the biggest financial institutions didn't trust each other. Money stopped moving. Panic set in. To stop the bleeding, the US government launched 2 massive, never-before-seen rescue missions. First, TARP, Troubled Asset Relief Program. In October 2008, Congress authorized $700 billion to buy toxic assets and inject cash directly into banks. Think of it as the government becoming a temporary shareholder in Wall Street. It was controversial. People hated the idea of bailing out the very banks that helped cause the mess. But The alternative? A full-scale collapse of the global financial system. Second, quantitative easing, QE. With interest rates already near zero, the Federal Reserve got creative. It began buying trillions of dollars in treasury bonds and mortgage-backed securities. This flooded the system with cash, lowered long-term interest rates, and encouraged lending and investment. It was monetary policy on steroids, and it changed how central banking works forever. Together, TARP and QE didn't just put out the fire. They redrew the blueprint for crisis management. But there was a cost. Critics warned that these bailouts created moral hazard, teaching Wall Street that it would always be rescued. Others pointed to how asset prices soared post-crisis, widening inequality as the wealthy saw huge gains while average Americans recovered slowly. Still, most economists agree. Without TARP and QE, we could have faced another Great Depression. Trump-China trade war. A trade war with the world's second-largest economy. What could possibly go wrong? In 2018, the US and China, two of the world's largest economies, went head-to-head in a high-stakes economic showdown. President Donald Trump kicked things off, accusing China of cheating the global trade system. The complaints weren't new. Intellectual property theft, forced tech transfers, huge subsidies to Chinese companies, and a massive trade deficit. But Trump was the first to really swing a hammer. His weapon of choice? Tariffs. The US slapped tariffs, basically taxes, on hundreds of billions of dollars worth of Chinese goods, starting with steel and aluminum, then expanding to everyday consumer items. China fired back with tariffs of its own, targeting US products like soybeans, pork, and machinery, which hit American farmers and manufacturers hard. What followed was a tit-for-tat tariff slugfest that stretched across 2018 and 2019. Supply chains were shaken, markets wobbled, uncertainty soared. Trump's goal? Force China to the table and extract a better deal, one that would stop unfair practices and boost US exports. After months of tense negotiations and Twitter threats, the two sides signed a Phase 1 trade deal in January 2020. China agreed to buy an extra $200 billion in US goods over 2 years and made vague promises on things like intellectual property. But many deeper issues, like tech dominance and state-backed companies, were left untouched. So, who won? It's complicated. Both economies took hits. US consumers paid more, farmers lost big contracts, and some manufacturers faced higher costs. China's exports slowed and global growth took a hit, but the trade war did shine a spotlight on unfair trade practices and pushed both countries to rethink their strategies. COVID-19 lockdowns and stimulus. In early 2020, the world hit the brakes hard. A mysterious virus was spreading fast. As COVID-19 exploded across borders, entire countries slammed into lockdown. In the US, streets emptied, businesses shuttered, flights were grounded, restaurants, schools, offices closed. Life was paused. The economy? It crashed overnight. Unemployment in America soared from a decade's low 3.5% in February to a jaw-dropping 14.7% by April, the worst since the Great Depression. Millions of workers were laid off. Entire industries like hospitality, travel, and retail were thrown into chaos. It wasn't a recession. It was an economic freefall. To stop the bleeding, the US government unleashed a tidal wave of money. Enter the CARES Act, a $2 trillion emergency package passed in March 2020. It was one of the largest stimulus efforts in US history. It included direct checks to Americans. Remember the stimulus payments? Boosted unemployment benefits. Loans and grants to small businesses through the Paycheck Protection Program. Support for hospitals, airlines, schools, and state governments. But that wasn't all. The Federal Reserve went full throttle, slashing interest rates to near zero, buying up trillions in government bonds, and opening emergency lending programs to keep credit flowing and prevent a financial meltdown. It worked. The economy hit rock bottom in spring, but began rebounding by summer. Stock markets recovered fast, businesses adapted, and consumer spending returned. But there was a cost. All that stimulus added trillions in federal debt. And the flood of money, combined with supply chain issues, helped fuel a wave of inflation that would hit hard in the years to follow. Powell rate hike surge. Prices were out of control. But could slamming the brakes trigger the next crash? Coming out of the COVID-19 pandemic, the U.S. economy was running hot. Too hot. Trillions in stimulus, near-zero interest rates, and a rush of pent-up consumer demand lit a fire under prices. By mid-2022, inflation wasn't just high, it was out of control, peaking at 9.1% in June, the highest in over 40 years. Enter Jerome Powell. As chair of the Federal Reserve, Powell had one job: bring inflation down. And he wasn't about to tiptoe. In March 2022, the Fed raised interest rates for the first time since 2018. Just a small bump, 0.25%. But that was only the beginning. Over the next 16 months, the Fed hit the gas on rate hikes like we hadn't seen in decades. June 2022, a 0.75% hike, the biggest since 1994. By July 2023, rates climbed to 5.25% to 5.50%, the highest in 22 years. Why such aggressive moves? Because inflation was being fueled by a perfect storm. Supply chains were still tangled from the pandemic. Energy prices spiked after Russia invaded Ukraine. Labor shortages and strong demand kept pushing prices higher. The Fed's goal was simple but risky: cool off the economy without crashing it. And that meant making borrowing more expensive, on mortgages, car loans, credit cards, and business financing. The effects were immediate. The housing market slowed down. Stock markets turned choppy. Fears of a recession started swirling. But by late 2023, there were signs it was working. Inflation began to cool. The Fed's message? The pain was necessary and temporary to restore long-term stability. Trump's reciprocal tariffs policy. In April 2025, President Donald Trump reignited the global trade battlefield. With a dramatic announcement from the White House, Trump unveiled a bold new strategy: the reciprocal tariffs policy. At its core, a simple but aggressive idea: if you tax our goods, we'll tax yours just as much, or more. Starting April 5, 2025, the U.S. slapped a 10% baseline tariff on imports from every country. But that was just the floor. Countries with large trade surpluses with the U.S. faced far steeper penalties. China, for example, got hit with a 54% tariff. Trump declared it a matter of economic self-defense, even going so far as to invoke a national emergency under the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, IEEPA, to push it through. The goal? To fight what the administration called decades of unfair trade, pointing to high foreign tariffs, currency manipulation, and non-tariff barriers that, according to Trump, stacked the deck against American goods. As an example, the White House claimed the European Union's trade policies effectively placed a 39% tariff on U.S. products. Markets didn't take the news lightly. Within hours, China retaliated, slapping a 34% tariff on American goods starting April 10th. Beijing also rolled out export controls and dragged the U.S. to the World Trade Organization. Global financial markets trembled. The S&P 500 took its steepest dive since the COVID crash, as fears of a full-blown trade war swept across the globe. Critics were quick to pounce. Economists warned of rising inflation, supply chain chaos, and slower economic growth. Others questioned the math, saying the tariffs were based on trade deficits, not actual trade barriers, making the policies more symbolic than strategic. Still, Trump stood firm. He argued this was the only way to level the playing field, bring jobs back home, and force trading partners to stop taking advantage of the U.S. economy. Whether it becomes a long-term economic strategy or just another chapter in the saga of America's trade battles remains to be seen. But one thing was clear: the era of easy global trade was over, and the tariff wars were back with a vengeance. These weren't just policy moves, they were shockwaves that reshaped the economy. And the next one? It might already be happening. If you want more breakdowns like this, hit like, subscribe, and turn on notifications, because history doesn't repeat, but it sure knows how to rhyme.